Thanks very much. So, hi everyone. My name is Rupert Myers. As Leah mentioned, I am IMSI's Circular Economy Challenge champion. So that's why I'm chairing this presentation today. I myself am a lecturer in Sustainable Materials Engineering in Imperial's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. But enough about me. Let's pass over to Jocelyn Blériot, who joined the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2007 after 12 years spent in the media and publishing industry. So having spent most of his career in the media industry as a journalist and editor, he was initially in charge of editorial matters at the foundation. So that includes overseeing content development and messaging. He now fully focuses on leading the organization's institutional engagement. He notably represents the foundation at the European Commission and manages its relationships with governments and supranational bodies such as the United Nations, the G7 Resource Alliance, the OECD, and the World Economic Forum. Jocelyn has an academic background drawing focus on literature, philosophy, and sociology. So without further ado, Jocelyn, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Rupert. As you might have noticed, I'm very much from a humanities background, so I'm intimidated to be in front of such a technically and technologically savvy audience. Just suffice to say that if you do have questions about polymers, molecular wizardry and all the rest, feel free to ask them. That doesn't mean that I will answer. The idea here is really to focus on the idea of a circular economy, how it came about, what it means for industry and for policy in terms of looking towards new ways of generating value, which is much less focused on consuming finite resources and making sure that we have a resilient system to go by in the future. So, and by the way, if you're slightly puzzled by my background, please do know that I am as well. This is a newly refurbished room in the foundation office here on the Isle of Wight. These things, I don't know what they are, but they don't appear synthetic. So when I touch them, they really do feel organic. It looks weird and it looks like an added Zoom background, but I can tell you they're literally stuck on the wall behind me. But enough about this. So as I said, I'm sitting in the foundation headquarters in Cowes on the Isle of Wight. The foundation was set up in 2010 by former yachtswoman Ellen MacArthur, who broke the single-handed round the world record in 2005. And there is a relationship, of course, between her previous career and what she does now. The idea was, when she was going around the world for that record, her obsession, more so than trimming the sails or navigating, of course, escaping the storms was a big one as well, but it was all about resource management. Because when you set off on a round the world journey, you want to be as fast as possible. And in order to do that, you take as little as possible with you to keep the boat light. But you still need the food, you still need the spare parts, you still need the energy for the generator, because the boat obviously relies on an electric autopilot. And in the Southern Ocean, when you're very, very far away from any civilization, the people closest to you are the people in the space station, actually. So if anything goes bad and the boat turns upside down due to a lack of energy for the autopilot, you really are in a critical position. And Ellen was thinking about these things as she was going around, thinking, actually, our economy is not much different. We rely on a finite supply and stock of materials that we've been burning through since the Industrial Revolution. And even if we do a bit less, and if we recycle a bit more and we reduce our impact, the end game is still the same. In other words, it's a bit like if you said, you're going to dig the same hole, just do it a bit slower. In the end, the result will be a hole. And when she stepped off the boat after a round the world record, she thought that she needed to dig a bit deeper. And the way she describes it is, imagine you're walking along the beach and you find a rock that looks a bit puzzling and out of place, you lift it up and what you find underneath is extremely surprising. You have two options. Either you just put it back and carry on as if nothing happened, or you dig deeper at the risk of being taken on a proper tangent, which is what she did. And when we started thinking about those ideas, it was a question of saying, can we bring a positive message to this story rather than just say, it's really horrible, we're doomed, and by the way, all the negative impacts of our industrial systems are just too big to tackle. So Ellen wanted a positive story, and we consulted with teachers, but also scientists, engineers, politicians, farmers, CEOs, to end up stumbling upon that idea of the circular economy, which I will develop on a bit later today. But the idea was really simple. It's how can we continue to grow the economy without necessarily growing its physical footprint? Can we decouple the economy from the material constraints and the negative externalities that we see, and that of course are in terms of air quality, pollution, waterways being clogged, etc., etc. And Ellen, being a very proactive and positively engaged individual, wanted to bring something that was actually inspiring and not doom and gloom. So I'll start sharing my screen now. Here we go. I hope all of this is fine for everyone. Rupert, can you confirm that?
Yeah, it is. I can see your screen shared. It's on Ellen MacArthur Foundation at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So just to put us a bit back in time and give some context, when we started the foundation, this graph was really trendy in certain circles. This was originally generated by Jeremy Grantham, who is an American who has a commodities-based investment firm and who is generally seen as one of the guys who identifies the mega trends before anyone else. And what he saw, and that was in April 2011, I think, what he saw was that the commodity prices and the volatility on commodity markets was such that it was probably more than just a blip from which markets would recover. And he started computing some numbers, and he discovered actually that between 1900 and 2000, so a century, basically the price of commodities had steadily declined over that period. So if you take an aggregated basket of commodities that include, wheat, but also oil and certain typical things that would be a staple of the consumer market, all of these things had declined through technological advance, but also discovery of new sources, feedstocks, etc. And if you put the historical accidents aside, so you see the world wars here and the oil shock, basically the trend was downwards. And what he saw between 2002 and 2011 was that actually that simple decade reversed and erased a century of price decline. So all of a sudden, everybody was looking at their material bill in industry thinking this is just completely crazy, and there is a need to secure the supply going forward, but also to have more visibility. To give you an example, the average European car manufacturer saw their raw material bill increase by 50% within a few months in 2012. And that really is a massive source of worry when you know that manufacturers don't make a lot of money on the actual production and sales of the vehicle. A lot of it now is in maintenance and contracts that are on the side. So we were in that context, really, resource constraints with a lot of new consumers coming online, the exhaustion of the traditionally easy to access reserve, a need for import, which was particularly true for Europe, which is a massive importer of resources. But we also saw that the enabling technologies and the digital revolution started to help peer-to-peer platforms, sharing platforms, things that we take for granted today, such as ride-hailing apps and mobility on demand. This was really emerging as a mega trend. We also saw, and it's even more true now, that despite the financial crisis, the long-term investment opportunities was the thing that was the focus for fund managers. They were not looking for quick and easy returns, knowing that the situation was different. They were starting to look at things that could have resilience built in. So supply shocks, but also taking into account the risk of climate change and accidents that were natural catastrophes that obviously wreak havoc on the economic system. So the investment community was waking up to these risks. And at the same time, civil society, and it says the new consumer here, I always have a problem with that term because it reduces citizens to consumers, which is not what should be the type of framing we should be using. But the bias of having access to the service rather than necessarily owning the product was starting to emerge. So granted, it's not yet a fully established trend, but we see it growing year on year. So, people really need to have clean clothes. They don't need to own the 50 or 60 kilos of cement, plastic, and steel that makes a washing machine, for instance. So these four elements and factors were really making the idea of a circular economy more attractive. And what we did, first of all, was to put the logic of an economy that would be able to give the access to the services and the products to consumers, and a growing number of them, without necessarily resorting to more and more consumption of raw finite resources. And our partners actually pushed us to that. They said, okay, so the idea seems very attractive and we can see the logic behind it, but what we need are facts and figures. So we commissioned a report from McKinsey & Company, who did the analysis, and we worked on the narrative. We launched this at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2012. And what this report showed was that if we adopt circular economy strategies such as design for disassembly, repurposing of components, recycling, but also mutualization of assets, so multiple users for one car, for instance, remanufacturing, planned maintenance, rather than addressing the problem once the asset is broken, how can we keep it longer in the system? We can see that by adding one cycle to the typical complex durable with medium lifespan, which could be your washing machine, but also TV, medical equipment. There was a net saving in terms of material that was between 300 and, let's say, 40 for the most conservative scenario, $340 billion a year. It's expressed in dollars because it's McKinsey, to something which was more advanced, including some policy changes, such as, for instance, mandatory product standards, to up to $630 billion. So in the categories that you see on the slide. So all of this saying, we're going to add by design one life cycle to each product, and say, we're going to put the collection in place and make sure that the manufacturers have an incentive to get their hands back on their products, because in the end, they are the material banks of the future if they are designed right. And I'll insist on that notion of design because it's sometimes counterintuitive, but it really is important. Now, this is the diagram that we came up after an excruciating week of fiddling with 275 versions of the same thing, trying to encapsulate what the circular economy is about. So we have on the left the three basic overarching principles, which of course are more aspirational and inspirational than actually precise technical guidelines. The idea is to say, from the design phase, can we make sure that the products that we put on the market will not end up polluting and clogging the system? Can they be repurposed? If they're on the technical side of things, can they be fed back to productive loops? If they're on the biological side of things, so that's food and farming material, but also biosource materials, can they actually go back to the ecosystem and feed them? Now, the second principle is about keeping those assets in use and making sure that we don't just make, dispose, and then go back to take, and then make, and then dispose all over again. So the strategies that are typically on that diagram towards the center of the diagram in the blue boxes, which is about sharing, reusing, maintaining, prolonging the life of the assets, etc. And then finally, the third principle really is about a regenerative model, one that builds economic but also social and natural capital by closing the nutrient loops on the left side of the diagram, showing that the organic waste, for instance, which typically at the moment is either landfilled or burned globally at very large expense of energy, by the way. And what could we use? Can we extract valuable molecules? Can we feed those nutrients back to the soil and address the chronic loss of soil productivity that we see around the world? And that diagram actually has been the basis of a lot of our thinking and other organizations as well. Now, the idea of a circular economy we did not invent, of course. It feeds off various schools of thought. Of course, Cradle to Cradle is one of the most emblematic one, and it's actually the one that should be credited for differentiating between the biological side of the economy and the technical one, and saying, you know, these are two separate things, and we need to keep them either separate or able to be separated, because one of the worst things is that the stuff that we put on the market, which is mixed and contaminated, is the best way to negate the value that we can recoup at the end of the first life cycle. So if you have things that are completely mixed, or a plant-based polymer, which looks nice on paper because you can stick a green label on it, but actually, what can you do? It might be plant-based, but there's no way that plant-based bottle can go back to the ecosystem and feed it. So addressing those imbalances and showing that there is a fundamental difference was really Cradle to Cradle. So Michael Braungart and Bill McDonough's big idea. Janine Benyus really pushed the biomimicry school of design, which is not necessarily about imitating nature, but taking inspiration from natural systems and the way they deal with their materials. Because fundamentally in nature, food is always available and nothing is wasted. A byproduct is going to be food for something else, or a next incarnation of a nutrient or a molecule. Walter Stahel, the Swiss architect and economist, really focused on the performance economy. So that idea that actually the assets that we have in circulation don't really need to be transferred in terms of ownership. What we want is the service that they perform, and not necessarily to be the owners of 1.5 ton of materials and polymer. We just want to get from A to B. We don't necessarily need a car. And by the way, the current statistic is that the average European car sits idle 92% of the time, which means that it's a loss of public space, all the infrastructure dedicated to it, etc., etc. So Walter's idea was really, can we put the models in place that distribute the access of those assets that are in circulation, make sure that their value is kept because the manufacturers treat them as their material banks, and we don't multiply the overcapacity that is already in existence. Imre Lovins is more a question of looking at natural capitalism as a framework and a paradigm, saying prices should reflect and integrate the negative externalities of economic systems. So production at the moment, you know, it is free to pollute. Essentially, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but society in general bears the cost of economic activity. And this is not reflected in the prices of the products that we buy. And as long as this happens, a proper circular economy will not reach scale. That's the big idea that Amory Lovins was pushing. And also, you know, a lot of what we hear now, which seem completely crazy at the time, really, is can we pay farmers to sequester carbon in the soil, for instance? And we hear about carbon farming at the moment. It's becoming a real idea. Now, finally, Tom Cradle in the Yale School of Environment and Forestry in the US, he's been pushing the idea of an industrial ecology. So not dissimilar to Janine Benyus's idea, actually saying, you know, one's byproducts is somebody else's feedstock. Is saying, how can we co-locate the industries that can feed off each other and make sure that those materials are kept and used until really there's no other option than to either dispose of them or recycle them. So all of these schools of thoughts have congregated and converged towards the idea of a circular economy, which appeared for the first time as an official terminology in Chinese politics in the 2008 Circular Economy Promotion Law, which is a continuation of the ecological society ideas. So Europe took an interest in the framework, and that was on the back of Ellen presenting the report that I was mentioning earlier in Davos to a couple of people from the European Commission, who then asked her to come and do a presentation in the European Commission, together with Jeremy Grantham, by the way, who was the man behind the script that I showed, the Century of Enterprise Decline. And what they said, started looking was, we really need to look beyond resource efficiency and say doing more with less and recycling a bit more isn't enough. We have to look upstream and to in a functioning circular economy, looking at where products are sourced, how they're designed from the outset to be reused and manufactured, but in a way and with a view to keep them in circulation at higher value possible. And what we've seen lately is the strategies and the national roadmaps and the initiatives and the clusters of enterprise co-locating in order to develop circular economy strategies has grown massively over time. So this graph is really an illustration because it bundles a lot of things together that don't necessarily compare. We'll have here an eco park at regional level, but also this takes of the national strategies and the private sector initiatives, the coalitions, etc. It really is just to show the evolution and the uptake of the idea, more than actually count things that can be aggregated and compared. But what it does say is that the context has been extremely resonant for these ideas. There's been a lot of interest, and on the national level, of course, we quote the French non-circular economy roadmap, the Dutch one, the Finnish one was actually the first one. The Finns have always been very, very pioneering in those ideas. We've seen that it goes beyond Europe. We have a Latin American and Caribbean Coalition for Circular Economy, which groups about 6 to 7 governments. That's convened by the United Nations Organization for Industrial Development. We have the government of Chile being very proactive on this as well. And going back to what the foundation does, so what we tried to do over the years was to say, let us look at how these strategies and ideas can apply at sectoral level. And we decided it could potentially be a good idea to take some iconically linear, and by linear I really mean those materials that typically go through the sequence of extraction of raw materials, production of goods, and then disposal by the end user of products. So really what we know is posable society, basically, which is the backbone of industrial revolution. We've known it. Again, oversimplifying because it's been refined along the way and it's now reaching levels of efficiency and sophistication that absolutely mine, but the essence of how we create value is we take resources, make something out of it, sell them, and then move on to the next batch because it needs to be replaced, or at least it is perceived to be replaceable. The first one of our what we call systemic initiatives was the plastics economy, and the idea here was that there's an inherent and intuitive notion in the public that because we talk more of recycling and we see more and more of these schemes, it's actually on the right track. And the plastic issue, which at the time didn't really look like one, it was just a sector with a couple of disadvantages when it comes to the longevity of the product. The plastics issue is reasonably well circumscribed and probably on the way to be solved because recycling is working. When what we saw actually was that globally, only 14% of plastic packaging, for instance, is collected for recycling. A further 4% of that gets lost in transit and doesn't even make it to the recycling plant. And the 10% that is effectively processed, only 2% of that is recycled at the same level of quality. So to put this simply, PET bottle to PET bottle performing the same service, that's only 2% globally. So the picture really isn't very flattering. So we looked at was, can we circularize this value chain and what would it need? Well, it needs a lot of thought going into feedstock, of course, what's on the market, both in terms of the nature of it, recyclable, but the volumes. Do we need to have absolutely all of these volumes of plastic packaging put on the market? Is there a potential for reuse as well? Can we think about distribution models that would rely on more durable containers that can be reused, for instance? At the outset, this idea seemed a bit far-fetched, but you see more and more creeping into it. We see that notion of refill containers. And once there is a proper logistics chain in place for them, my sense and the sense of the team at the New Plastics Economy is that it's going to become something completely normal, and we'll just consider that it's the way things are done. The disposable era might soon look like something with a bit of a we struck out the reasonable path that way. And from mobilizing the idea, and I'm taking you through the thinking when it comes to how we structure our systemic initiative. So we paint the picture, paint the vision of where the gains can be made, then we mobilize the whole value chain around this idea, and really taking people from the polymer manufacturer, the chemists that are coming up with those molecules, all the way to the people who dispose of the plastic products, whether that in industrial settings or at municipal. And we create the conditions of dialogue because it seems very obvious, but I would be surprised at the level of implementation that people who did products and the people who are responsible for their end of life really rarely talk to each other. It's true even within the same company. So in that mobilization and get people to agree on a common sense of direction, we created on the back of the New Plastics Economy, together with UNEP, the United Nations Programme for Environment, what we call the global commitment that aligns with the New Plastics Economy vision of only putting on the market plastic that is either recycled, recyclable, or compostable. To date, we have just shy of 1,000 signatories in governments, but a lot of companies, of course, that represent a combined 20% of global plastic packaging put on the market. So these people commit to very specific targets that we document, and we're about to publish the 2020 version of the Global Commitment Report, on which you can see what company has promised what and where they are on their journey. The idea really is to create that groundswell. Now, I spent a bit of time on the new plastics economy one because it is pretty iconic, and we've seen that it was resonant with ideas that were in the public domain as well, with David Attenborough's documentaries. There was generally a rebellion against plastic over the past 2 years. Now we've taken that same approach to textile and fashion, the new textiles economy, which we now call Make Fashion Circular. That was the original design that you see here. And it is the same, look at what we put on them, how cotton is grown, what are the environmental impacts, is there scope for reuse, can we also do some of the wrongs of the fast fashion, which means that every year there's an ever-rising volume of textile in the municipal waste streams at great costs for municipalities and society. But also, can we look at the hidden potential, maybe when it comes to, for instance, reducing the carbon footprint of the textiles value chain, which is quite staggering. The report states that the textile value chain globally has a carbon footprint which is equivalent to aviation and shipping combined. So it really is not insignificant at all. And of course, there are issues around plastic pollution because the clothes that we wear and that we wash shed a lot of microfibers, and that's less visible than a plastic bag in the environment. But the damage it's doing by accumulating is considerable. So here again, same logic, coalition of partners, manufacturers, designers, and really tapping into the power of communication that this industry typically has, because contrary to the plastic packaging manufacturers, the fashion industry very much visible, is very glamorous. It's a sexy subject. So we wanted also to make sure that we turn the thing that leading figures could support, and we've had a lot of success working together with Stella McCartney, for instance, who is very involved in those questions. We've also looked at the food angle and the organic potential when it comes to recapturing some of the nutrients that currently just goes to waste, because cities are great aggregators of food products and food stuff, but actually that production which happens somewhere outside of the city yields outputs that create byproducts which are super valuable but never go back to the field, and that creates an imbalance as well. So we started looking at reverse logistics. How can we involve retailers, food manufacturers, and really try to create that dynamic again, that if it came out of something biological, surely it can go back to feeding the next cycle of biological regeneration, which really is at the heart of the circular economy and that principle. So at the moment, what we have are 3 systemic initiatives: plastics economy, Make Fashion Circular, and what we now call the food initiative. It goes beyond cities. And the latest report that we published is about financing the circular economy, because what we've seen is that over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the funds that have performed the best were the ones that have an ESG component, so that's environment, social governance. And this is consistent with a trend that we've seen over the past few years, which is there is more and more calls for fund managers to ask their prospective clients or the companies that they will maybe hypothetically invest to disclose their climate risk exposure, for instance. And we'll go back to climate a bit later. But it is that sense that if we're not investing in an economy that can run in the long term, we're probably shooting ourselves in the foot. This is why there was an explosion of interest. To give you an example, in 2018, there was only one identified fund with a circular economy component. In the first half of 2020, there are now 18 of them. And we see that's ever growing. We signed a partnership with BlackRock recently. The fund that they put together for circular economy just hit $1 billion in value, which is, by their own admission, an unprecedented meteoric rise for these ideas. And why is this important in the grand scheme of things? So there is, of course, that notion that the circular economy deals with materials management and the pollution aspect of it, and the visible, very tangible impact of material on our societies. And of course, it's a good strategy to save on costs for companies that want to reduce their material bills, etc. But what we saw as well was that the circular economy and the material economy, that goes way beyond a simple question of reverse logistics and waste management, because the material society that we have has a massive impact when it comes to the CO2 emissions, GHG in general. And we started to look at these questions and looking at the emission landscape globally and having conversations with experts showed us that the current response to the global climate crisis essentially is an incomplete picture, because today the efforts to tackle the climate crisis have focused on transition to renewable energy, which is massively important, complemented by efficiency goals, mostly in transportation and buildings where the biggest impact happened. But although these measures are, of course, crucial by themselves, they can only address 55% of emissions. The remaining 45% come from the way we make and use products and how we produce food and manage the land, which is great, because it means that this is actually room for improvement. And typically those questions are not really connected. So we see that the international community focus on climate and the COP21 and the Paris Agreement. They're reaching, sometimes it feels like they're receding on what we do with energy. If we open up the product side and the material side of the economy, we can make a massive dent in that vexing problem of GHG emissions and climate change. Because the research that we carried out together with Material Economics in Sweden showed that if we apply the circular economy in areas such as cement, plastic, steel, aluminum, and food, we can remove nearly half of these remaining emissions. 9.3 billion tons by 2050, which basically is exactly like saying we're going to bring the whole global transport system, including passenger vehicle, to net zero by 2020. That's the equivalent emissions of that whole sector. Putting in place those strategies is then a fundamental step towards achieving climate targets. So we're taking that notion of the circular economy out of the traditional waste management and materials management sphere where it usually is confined. Now I'm going to go a bit quicker for the end because I see that we're reaching, and that's an animation, so I have to click a lot. But basically, what we wanted to do was to say, okay, so how do these strategies line up with the fundamental principles of the circular economy? So if we design waste and pollution out, it means designing products with circularity. It means from the outset saying, a market that will not need full replacement within X month. How can we make sure that what we do and what we create does not generate waste that doesn't have a place in the system? Can we substitute materials? Can we look more towards bio-based materials whilst adding toxic additive that means that it can't regenerate natural systems? Now, the second principle of keeping those that view the embedded carbon, the embedded work and water in use at the same at all times by keeping those materials in circular and productive loop. It's about the business model of use, the investment in infrastructure for refactoring, the recirculation of those materials, and to a certain extent, the modular form of certain types of materials as well and components. If you think about the built environment, for instance, can we design a building as a material bank and identify through digital technologies all the components that go into it and know where they are, so that by the time the building is not fit for purpose, or can we deconstruct it rather than demolish it? And then, just like a Lego brick house, build something different out of it that suits the new needs by having clearly documented and fed into a database all these components. And of course, the regeneration of natural system, which is the third principle, really the biggest lever by far here is regenerative agriculture, which also has the added benefit of sequestering a lot of carbon in the soil. And it's also good for biodiversity, which we will be working on as an organization this year to bring a more complete picture about what the circular economy can do for biodiversity. Bearing in mind 2021 is the year for COP15 biodiversity in China, and it's going to be a really hot topic. So without going too much into detail, I think what we saw that the opportunity does come from making better use of products and materials within key sectors. Solutions, they are cost effective, they offer a lot of benefits. Industry is responsible, and that's according to the IPCC, for around 21% of overall global CO2 emissions. Now, the product of the four materials which I've listed in the previous slide, which is cement, steel, plastics, and aluminium, account for 60% of these 21%. So it's a massive thing. Looking quickly at scenarios for key sectors, and I can put the link to the full report because I appreciate that it would be interesting to go into the detail of these figures and look at the model as well. So we'll share the link with you. So for the built environment by 2050, circular scenario really focusing a lot on design for modularity, as I explained before, and that could yield to a CO2 emission reduction of 38% by 2050. For passenger cars, and that's an interesting one actually, the saving could be 7% of CO2 emissions. And when we think about CO2 savings associated with cars, we think at the exhaust level. Can we put more electric vehicles on the road? And that's part of the solution, that's true. But there's another graph that I'll show later that actually highlights the importance of the business model aspect as well. Mutualization of assets is actually a bigger lever than production processes and changes in material recirculation, for instance. So if we take a ton of primary steel per million of passenger kilometer, the reduction is actually staggeringly higher when it comes to circular business model. And say if a car has 6 users during its active lifetime and a multiplicity of life cycles, then that's where the biggest saving is, which is somewhat counterintuitive because you could think that actually refining production processes and doing away with internal combustion engine is where the sweet spot is for CO2 emission reduction. But actually, the more you utilize the asset, which means the less you multiply the number of these assets, that's where the greatest saving is. And that really is interesting. In agriculture and food, we see a massive potential as well, a lot due to regenerative farming, as I said. So diversification of crops, grazing and crops in the same area to sequester carbon and favor biodiversity. Again, there is a lot of detail in the report that I don't have time to go into right now, but this will be made available to you. So I think in order to keep a bit of time for the conversation, I'll stop here. I guess one of the key messages I'd like to leave you with as well is that it is at the moment a very important pivot point for the global economy that is looking at how to restart and post-COVID make sure that there is at the same time the potential to address the immediate challenges and the immediate pain and suffering in economic terms, but also prepare for the future. So we've seen a lot of calls for green deals, renovation of buildings that would take into account the climate targets, and the general move towards how can we prepare for a future economy which will be more resilient, because we know that these type of shocks are coming and the menace of climate change is looming as well, and it's threatening a lot of activity. So that conversation, which may have started as a technical one in terms of materials management and secularization of supply, because we need that access to those raw materials. And it maybe was the worry when the circular economy came out in the first place, is how can I save money and make sure that I'm not exposed to supply risk? It's now turning into a bigger conversation about what kind of model for society do we want, and how will we generate value in a world that is resource constrained and also is seeing a growing number of consumers with great spending power coming online. Not in Europe, of course, but in the, we used to say emerging economies. Seems like they have emerged and they're still emerging. They're now growing very, very fast with a rate of urbanization which is unprecedented. How can we cater for that and have a system that at the same time allows regeneration and makes sure that the ecosystem services that we rely upon are not only not damaged, but enhanced and increased? Thanks for that. I'll stop now and take some of your questions.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We can move on to questions. We've got a couple in the Q&A at the moment, which I'll just reiterate and then put them to you, Jocelyn, to answer. Okay, so the first one comes from Helen Edwards. I'll just read out the question. Can you discuss the amount of low carbon energy needed for particular recycling or reuse options?
That's a bit technical, and I'm not sure I'm the best place to talk about that. But I would be happy to have to put my experts in contact with Helen. I'm assuming she's referring to some of the hard to abate sectors and what the potential is for electricity, for instance, that is generated by renewable sources, to make a proper dent in sectors that we know are extremely energy intensive and are going to be difficult to put on a low carbon path.
Maybe Helen can follow up if that didn't answer her question.
I think she will need more detail than that.
Yeah. Okay, so the second question we have is from Nicholas Harrison, who thanks you for a very interesting talk. This is what Nicholas said. I was struck by your focus on products and materials. Cement stands out. I am wondering what a circular scenario for cement is. At first sight, it is simply an irreversible release of CO2 ? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's extremely early days for the cement question. I don't think the potential is massive and very obvious either, but I know that the questions are being asked, and I was actually taking part in some really interesting conversations at the G20 level under the Saudi Arabian presidency this year. And I've heard a lot of experts from the cement industry scratching their heads and not exactly knowing what, apart from building modular structures and agreeing on certain standards for building, so you have that idea of a Lego brick really, instead of crashing it and reducing it to either aggregate or filling or other applications. Really, the way to keep the value of cement circulation would be to have these prefabricated blocks or slab that can be modularized and used. And that seems to be the biggest strategy at the moment.
Sure. So I can add to that as well. So we're actually a world-leading hub of expertise in cement science here at Imperial College, and ways that ways CO2 does get reabsorbed in products. Not that much. It depends on how you treat cement at end of life. But you can also use different chemistries, and this means that less CO2 can be emitted during the production stage. Reuse of components is a very good one too, as Jocelyn mentioned. But there are for the cement system, it's very hard to mitigate the CO2 emissions in the sector. So we basically need to work along the entire value chain for the cement sector. And this includes developing new recycling technologies, not only using them as a secondary aggregate. I think we should be thinking about developing higher value added materials as well. So hopefully that helps to answer your question, Nicholas. So now there are no more in the Q&A. So I suppose I have a comment and then a question. I have a question I wanted to ask you, Jocelyn, a particular one. I just wanted to say about industrial ecology. So I'm in the industrial ecology community. I actually worked with Tom Cradle, so that was great to see Tom there. I was there in 2016-17. So I think it's important to note that we're an academic community and research field, and so we're doing more than just industrial symbiosis. So Jocelyn, your description was about industrial symbiosis significantly, but we also focus across the entire sort of life cycles of materials as well. And we do this sort of scientifically rigorous research that in how we use materials and how we use energy throughout product life cycles and material cycles. And we also hope to be viewed as a home of circular economy scholarship. So we can help also, industrial ecologists also want to help develop the circular economy too. We just have a question on so there was a question about cement being carbon negative. I can talk about this later, but I wanted to ask Jocelyn a question. So you mentioned at the start of your presentation, a key aim of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation was, how can we grow the economy without growing our material footprint? So here you're referring, I think, to the concept of decoupling. Is that? So I wanted to know that I think this is, absolutely we need to decouple. I wonder though about the focus on growing the economy. Do you think it's also important to think about redistributing wealth, particularly to developing nations? I've been talking for a little while, so I don't really want to mention, but there is an interesting paper which suggested that we need to think about a sufficiency-based approach, which essentially means the direct downscaling of economic production in many sectors, as well as reducing consumption. So what do you think about that sort of viewpoint relative to the growing economy? Can we do both at the same time?
Yeah, and I think maybe I've been a bit ambiguous in my statement. We don't have an ambition to help grow the economy. What we want to do is to help redefine growth, is to make sure that that notion of increasing material comfort, access to health and education, and what we've seen generally as economic progress, which is legitimately required by a lot of countries which need to reach our level of material comfort, doesn't carry on along the same model that we've seen, which is extremely extractive and destructive. So it's not the mission of the foundation to push growth. It is the mission of the foundation to redefine it and make sure that where it happens, because it is needed in a lot of parts of the world, it does happen in a way which is compatible with the physical limits of the planet and the ecosystems that sustain it.
Right. So in the way that I have come sort of my view is that there is a desire, and we desire to sort of the shift to focus more on services or to well-being rather than to production, and that would then be consistent with a healthy planet as well as a healthy society. That's great. Look, we have 2 minutes left. I think that it could be tough to read out this last question because it's quite long. Jocelyn, do you have any final comments before you close? Perhaps maybe you could say how we could engage more closely Imperial College London, IMSI and Ellen MacArthur Foundation before we wrap up.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for that. And I realize that for quite a portion of the audience, my lack of technological and scientific expertise may have been frustrating, but I'm really happy to answer your question, to say how can we engage more closely, is to give access to the people who have that knowledge and expertise, can answer the tricky questions. What we can do as well, of course, is to consider that if, according to the International Resource Panel, the environmental impact of a product is determined, 80% of that impact is determined at the design stage. And of course, it's a question of feedstock, and it's a question of what we put on the market. So the nature and the volume of it. So materials are critically important. And if we think that we can look at developing a circular economy at scale with what we have currently at the moment, then it's a no-go area, because a lot of these materials that we have are not circularity compatible. They would compound the toxicity problem by accumulating. They're not just safe materials that you can loop endlessly. We still need that. So material science is a critical part. And what we could potentially do is think and bang our heads together and say, okay, we have the material science side of things. How does that fit into your model, and where, sector by sector, are the biggest potential applications? Where is there traction for this? What's needed? What are the gaps? What are the financing opportunities as well? Because if the finance community it does acknowledge the potential of a circular economy going forward, in order to make it work, then we need the components, we need the building blocks. Where are they? Who's leading that research, and what do they need? I see a lot of avenues, and of course, you know, I was brought to this stage today by our head of learning team, who I'm sure you will be following up with to generate an even closer collaboration between our two organizations.
So thanks very much, Jocelyn. I'm sure we'll follow up. That sounds like a great way to engage more closely. These final questions, I'll get, I think, Leah she can put them to you, or someone else at the EMF. But otherwise, that will be us for today's webinar. Thank you very much. It was great to listen to your talk and to be here with you. Leah, do you want to say some final words?
I just wanted to say a big thank you to Jocelyn and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for doing this highlight seminar for us. That was really great, and thank you for getting through so many questions. Thank you very much to Dr. Rupert Myers as well for agreeing to chair today. That was really great. So if you do have any more questions, I would most happily forward them on. Please do just email me or the IMSI inbox, and I can pass them on to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But I just wanted to say thank you very much. A recording of this will be on our YouTube channel, and I hope everyone has a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you. See you later.